My name is Ariane Sprague, and I'm going to talk about how to be an interviewer. So I don't know how many of you, I guess by a show of hands, have actually interviewed someone to see if you wanted to hire them. Nice. It's a good number. And how many expect that you'll probably be on the other side interviewing in the relatively near future? Cool. So you may be wondering, like, why I'm going to be talking about how to be an interviewer if it's not necessarily guaranteed that everybody becomes one. I think it's really useful to know what's happening on the other side of the table. So for example, if you know how an interviewer thinks, how we approach who we're going to hire, who we're looking for, how we're sourcing, how we're going through the whole process, if you have an inside view into what's actually happening, it gives you a lot more tools, and it becomes a lot less scary to try and navigate the very stressful, very frustrating, and painful process of hiring or getting hired. So a bit about me. I have a bachelor's in CS and mathematics from U of O. I've been a software engineer professionally for about a decade now. Started with a lot of JavaScript, actually did Flash and all of that, so I love the front end, but I've bounced all over the tech stack. Some of the companies I've worked for, I worked for Palantir down in the Bay Area, a few of the other Bay Area startups down there, and I did a lot of my interviewing actually at Palantir. That's where I did the majority of it, and I was on their college recruiting pipeline, so trying to bring in a lot of mostly college candidates and see whether or not they'd be a good fit for the role. Palantir had an interesting setup where they would just hire as many people as they could. There were always job openings, which is not true, obviously, for every company. And it's important to understand what the company's motivations are, which I'll get to in a minute. I've interviewed a little over 100 people for various primarily engineering roles, a couple of folks for product roles, but it was mostly focused on engineering. I started a startup, I ended that startup, and I'm currently a staff engineer at Hinge Health, and I've been a staff engineer for 27 hours and 3 minutes now. So it's a recent thing. But we are hiring. We're actually hiring in Portland, and I'm the first Portland hire. So that's pretty exciting, and I'm really looking forward to that. So, right into the interviewing. In my opinion, interviewing is fairly broken because it's not agreed upon across a lot of companies and a lot of different places what actually makes a good candidate and what is necessary to actually determine whether or not somebody will be a good candidate for the job. So, in my opinion, a good interviewer actually wants you to succeed. There's definitely this fear of if you go into an interview, it's meant to trick you. It's meant to be like a pop quiz or some equivalent to that. And some interviews actually are. Some interviews will come out and say, here's a surprise question. There's the infamous manhole cover question that Google used to ask, which doesn't really have anything to do with whether or not you'll be successful at a job. And that's why they stopped asking it. So they want you to succeed. Like they're really hoping that you do, in particular because interviewing is challenging and it's expensive and it's not quite as stressful, but it is still fairly stressful for the interviewer and the company, just in a very different way. So the sooner you can actually hire someone who can fall into the role, who can get the job done, the better off you are, and the more you can focus on what your primary business objectives are. A good interviewer has specific, measurable metrics that they use to determine job success. So sometimes you can have an interviewer that will come in and they're looking for you to give them a feeling, like they want to talk to you a bit and then they'll feel, relatively positive about you. That's not specific. That's not measurable, and that's basically prone to every single type of bias anybody on the planet could have, because you're just waiting to see whether or not someone, gives you a good thumbs up feeling, whether you go and grab a drink with them. That's not a qualification for being able to do the job in any way, shape, or form. There's an interesting there's an interesting phrase that has gotten a lot of flack and feedback recently, which is culture fit, because it's very vague and it's a really easy way to just reject a lot of candidates for unfair reasons. However, the flip side of that, which is value, is what does the company value? What does the company actually want in their employees beyond just being able to engineer, be able to code? Do they want people who are able to think fairly quickly on their feet? Not every job needs that. Some jobs are very process-oriented, and that's okay. some jobs actually require you to deal with a lot of unknowns. Neither is better or worse, but that can be a job requirement, and that can be a value. And that used to be what culture fit was meant to kind of look towards, but recently it's just been a bit of a mess and it's gotten a bad rap, which makes sense. A good interviewer searches for proof, for evidence that you meet the minimum requirements for a job. A minimum is key here, and this is something that I've seen a lot of, particularly in job postings. They'll put their ideal candidate, which means for a junior dev entry-level role, they'll probably put 2 years of experience, want these 3 different languages, and ideally you'll know how to use Express pretty well if it's, a node role. That's not in any way reasonable for an entry-level role, and oftentimes that's not what the company requires. It's kind of funny, but you'll see companies hire a lot of people that don't fit their job description. Their job description fits nobody who they've ever hired, which means they're now losing out on a lot of candidates. So focusing on the minimums, focusing on what you absolutely must have in a job. For example, if you're hiring for a senior role, maybe you do have a minimum of 3 years. But that would be the minimum. And that makes sense for a senior role. A good interviewer knows the company's risk tolerance, which I'll get more into later, but that's kind of what measures how hard you want the interview to be and how you focus on which pieces are challenging, which pieces are difficult. And a good interviewer measures both the hard coding and the soft skills, communication. Engineering and software development is an inherently social job, even though there's a kind of bad rap for just being people in light caves coding away. It's actually really important to be able to communicate about everything that you're doing. And then lastly, a good interviewer knows that you're interviewing them at the same time that they're interviewing you. You're getting an idea of what the company values based on what kind of questions they ask. And you're also getting an idea of whether or not you fit there based on, for example, did they come running into the interview room stressed and sweating because they were late, they were up all night last night, pushing a bunch of fixes, and just woke up. That sends a signal about what your job might look like if you work there. So, being good is hard. It's hard for a number of reasons. A lot of interview, yes.
Sorry, the presentation isn't showing up on here.
Oh. Let's fix that.
Sorry, guys.
Oh, that's super weird. Well, I'll stop presenting and start presenting again, and
Okay.
hope that fixes it. Okay, that's what happened. EK display. Cool, this should work. And can somebody confirm?
No.
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 Oh. I think it's because the VGA port, or the screen sharing is having trouble with the VGA. So let me try this one last time. That doesn't look good. Okay. Let's try. Any left? Give it a second.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thumbs up?
Yes.
Perfect.
Thank you.
So being a good interviewer is hard. You have 90 minutes, generally at most, to determine whether or not somebody is going to be able to work with you for the next 3 to 5 years. That's really not a lot of time to try and make a ton of assessments about whether or not this person can do the job and whether or not they'll be able to do it well and whether or not they'll want to do it. Maybe they have other priorities and they'll leave in 3 months. So that's one big challenging part. Another is that the job requirements actually change pretty quickly with business requirements. So you see this a lot in the job postings. There'll be a job posting that's fairly stale, same thing. It says we want 2 years experience, we want JavaScript, we want TypeScript, we want Node, and we maybe want React. And those are the things that you absolutely must have in a junior role. Let's say a company then hires 2 senior devs that know TypeScript really well and can train a bunch of more junior devs in TypeScript. Is that now a requirement? Well, if you have the capacity within your company to be able to actually train people, that should no longer be a job requirement. But you have to go through and audit that pretty regularly and audit your job postings to figure out whether or not your job requirements still fit your business requirements. And those get stale constantly. Like they just do. because it's oftentimes not as high of a priority as 20 other things that are, which is understandable. We're all biased. And there's like the obvious biases that have been coming up a lot in news and studies about like racial and gender biases, and I'm not even talking about those, though that is absolutely there. I'm talking about the most basic biases that are, I like this person, or I don't like this person. Like just that initial gut reaction that tons of things go into. And that'll bias us. I experience it quite often, and I'll like somebody, I'll be like, oh, this person seems pretty cool, and then I'll just want to hire them. But I have no evidence whether or not that they're going to be capable of doing the job, and I've had a lot of circumstances where I went, I really like this person, I want you to succeed, and then it just bombed, and I was really sad, but I saw the evidence in front of me and went, I don't think this person will be capable of doing this job, which is unfortunate for everybody. But that does happen. And the obvious metrics that people use are pretty broken. Years of experience, college pedigree, and the number of jobs or the types of jobs that you've had historically aren't great indicators, but they're used because they're easy. If I see someone's gone to Stanford, well, I basically offloaded all of the work of vetting someone, or a lot of the work of vetting someone, onto Stanford. Because Stanford rejects like 98% of people. So I know if someone comes from them, they're probably going to be good, right? Well, there's a whole set of issues there too, but that is true. Like your actual pool has already been filtered for you. So that's what a lot of people do, and it's easy to justify. But they're not very valuable. You end up rejecting a lot of people who would have been fantastic at the job, to the detriment both of your company and to them. So, the way that you start to fix this is you have a hiring pipeline. Did fit, beautiful. So, there are a lot of different hiring pipelines out there, but there's a general strategy for trying to figure out whether or not a candidate is going to be able to do a job, and try and do it as cheaply and with as little time as possible, both for yourself and for that candidate. Because if it turns out it's not a good fit, then you don't want to waste anybody's time. This is just an example one that I threw together. Your mileage may vary. Some companies do various parts of this, some companies swap the order, but it goes around something like this. And the first step is figuring out the job requirements. We create a posting. Like, we don't necessarily think about that as the first step of the interview process, but that's it. Because a lot of people will end up self-selecting out of actually applying to a job if it looks like they can't get it to begin with. And if your job requirements are too high, which is why I keep emphasizing minimum, then you're going to lose out on a lot of candidates that you've never even heard about. So unfortunately, the other thing that happens is that means that if you're looking for a job, your best strategy is to apply for things that you don't necessarily look qualified for and just shotgun it. Because some companies are really looking to hire, they're willing to hire below what they say their minimum requirements are, and then they'll just bring you on board. So it creates this imbalance where if you're willing to stick your neck out a little bit, you're much more likely to get a job. And if you're a company that's hiring, you're going to, again, lose out on a lot of really qualified candidates. So that's always the first step. Next is sourcing, and a ton of things go into that. Like there's the LinkedIn sourcing, there is just random meetups that you meet people at, there are networks, and how you source changes your actual candidate pipeline pretty dramatically. I'm not going to dive too much into that just because it's a whole giant topic that I'm nowhere near an expert on. Like, I'm not a recruiter. But that is how you'll bring in a lot of the candidates after you have your requirements. And then there's the recruiter conversation, which is usually vetting the most basic minimum requirements. If the job requires you to move, are you willing to move? If the job requires 10 years experience and is actually a hard requirement, and you have 0, well, someone messed up and clearly that's not the right fit. But that's all it is. It's not a real interview in my opinion. It's basically going through and vetting that, hey, these basic criteria are met, let's move them on to the actual pipeline. And then you get a mix of things. So there's automated screening, there are phone screens, and there are on-sites, and these are usually the order that they go in. The reason I keep going back to job requirements is because your different screening processes, the automated, the phone, and the on-site, should be focusing on testing for different requirements, different specific requirements. So an automated screening should be actually pretty easy. It should test whether or not you can do really basic coding, and that's it. Can this person just do basic for loops, ifs, make a function, maybe create a class? That's it. A lot of it's really hard. So when I was running my startup, I started to run a little low on money. So I did what a lot of people do, and I went and tried to get some contracting work. There's a company that does remote contracting as a service, essentially, and so I went and interviewed with them. I have a good amount of experience. I feel relatively confident in my abilities to make a web app, and that's what they were looking for. They put me through the automated screening process, and I failed so badly. I got a 20%. It was atrocious. It was a hard no. Here's the weird thing. They emailed me and they said, hey, so in polite terms, they said, you clearly failed. If you have any questions or thoughts, let us know. And I did. I had lots of opinions. So the automated screening gave me questions that I needed to remember my 9th grade trigonometry math from, and then write a function based around that. And I needed to do various versions of that 3 times in about 90 minutes. And I told them that their interview was bad because they're interviewing me for a React web dev position. I haven't seen this stuff since high school. Their question actually didn't have anything to do with what they were trying to hire for. And I threw in a little bit of a zinger by telling them that it also biased them towards a younger crowd and potentially embed ageism in, because the further away you are from high school, the harder it is to remember, and just threw that in there. I got an email back telling me I was accepted to the second round. And then they gave me an offer, and it didn't work out. But the point is, their automated screening process was garbage. I just told them it was garbage, and they let me out of the next step. You really need to make sure that you're testing for what matters to you. Then you move on to the phone screen. Automated screening is meant to just filter through, hey, can this person code? Great, okay. Phone screen is meant to look a little bit more about, can they communicate, and can they work on a little bit harder problems? You can only determine so much about whether or not this person is able to, communicate really well, because a lot of communication happens visually and physically. There's a lot of whiteboarding when you're doing a coding job, what is the architecture? You have a lot of back and forth with colleagues, and it's really hard to do over the phone. So it's basically meant to be ideally a slightly amped up of the automated screening, and making sure that, yeah, you are able to communicate just in a basic way that I can understand what's happening. The questions generally are easier, and they should be pretty, relatively doable. So, go to the phone screen, and then there's the on-site, and these are cadence. Every company does them differently. Some companies do huge algorithm whiteboarding problems. I'm not a fan of those, maybe because I'm not the best at those, but that's one way to do it. There's some companies that'll do actual on-site projects. There is a wide variety. And again, these things need to be focused on what am I actually testing for, which I'll dive into in a bit. Last stages after you pass the on-site, ideally, will be due diligence, checking your references, and any other things, background check, making sure that you don't have any active warrants. And then extending an offer, and hopefully the candidate accepts. This is one version. Like I said, they can swap around a lot, but there's a lot of details in how each of these steps happens. As I said, and I will continue to say, the most important thing, in my opinion, starting is know your requirements and require the minimum. Get as many people as you can in the sourcing pipeline, know what you're measuring them for, and then start filtering down as you collect evidence that the person either will or will not be able to do the job you're hiring for. Not 9th grade algebra, the job. Defining requirements is hard. And you folks have probably seen a lot of versions of this in job postings. So, what is a must-have for the job? Are there years of experience required? Is prior experience in the same role actually required? And when I say required, I mean if someone doesn't say yes to this checkbox, you will immediately stop talking to them politely, but you're done. Is a specific coding language or platform required? And I use those 3 as the first because I think that's oftentimes what's put out there as the requirements, and I think they're all pretty fuzzy and oftentimes not true. again, people look for the maximum. I'm like, here's my ideal candidate. Here's what I think the best would be. And a lot of folks don't apply. So I honestly think most of the time, those actually aren't hard requirements, with the exceptions being for really specific roles. Are you looking for some sort of executive, like a CTO? Yeah, you probably want some past experience. Are you looking for someone who's an expert in information security, patch vulnerabilities in your app? You better believe that there's some hard requirements about experience there. But for a lot of development roles, that's not true. I've been hired for jobs where I've never done anything like the job before whatsoever. It didn't matter, because the hardest requirement that most jobs do require, and sort of vaguely say, is your ability to learn quickly on the job, and your ability to adapt to new changing environments, because technology is constantly changing every single week, every single month, every single year. So a couple of others. Physical location, that's a pretty easy one. Like, if you're willing to move to San Francisco or Portland, Oregon, or New York or not, great. That works, or that doesn't. Then there's the slightly softer ones that I feel like, in my opinion, are probably some of the more important ones. Like, are you able to communicate complex thoughts and ideas in a way that I'm able to understand, or that someone else is able to understand? Are you able to take ownership of problems and projects? And these are oftentimes listed as requirements. You know, are you able to give feedback and receive feedback on a team? Are you curious, and do you want to learn? And another interesting one is, for some jobs, are you able to handle high-stakes environments or highly regulated environments? Those are actually hard requirements. Is this person capable of managing HIPAA data? Like, can they not copy and paste someone's social security number or their medical record into an email and send it? Is that something that will be obvious to them? And if the answer is no, then you can't hire that person, because that's illegal in your company. You can get fined a lot of money, or for fee violations, shut down. So clearly that's a hard requirement. The other ones, though, like curiosity, that's vague, it seems. We all have an emotional understanding of what that seems to mean. We feel like we can identify it when we see it, but how do you actually measure for that? Specifically, in a specific way. So I'll go through just a quick example of how I would start to break that down for an interview. Like, how would I measure someone's curiosity? The first thing is curiosity, as I would define it, is the desire to learn more and to understand. And that would be a key thing, is the desire to understand something else. So there's two ways that I could think of measuring that and trying to identify that. One are historical examples. You know, it's the general, please tell me sometime in your past that you have been curious. Not a great question, but you can find more specific, like better versions of, please tell me a time where you tried to went above and beyond in learning something new. I think those are okay. Most people are honest, some people will lie through their teeth. So you want more than one data point. Which is the second part, which is, how do you see examples live of curiosity in the interview process? So if I'm trying to think through this, I want to see someone exhibit a desire to learn more and to actually do that, which means I have to give them unknowns. I have to give them things that they're not going to know right off the bat. And there can be a fine line between this and like, ha, gotcha, manhole, why is it round? You know, that's not curiosity, that's a gotcha. Curiosity, however, does require creating an environment where I'm going to ask something that is going to be hard and is going to make the candidate think, I'm not sure. And then I want to see them work through it and be willing to work through it with me. So if I see, hey, there's this unknown here, how would you approach that? And if somebody comes back to me and then says, I don't know, I'm like, okay, cool, good place to start. How would you move forward? And if they start asking questions, they start saying, hey, well, I don't understand this particular input to this function. Like, it's a string, but there's a format here, and can I have more, like, it requires space delineation, and can I have more than one space? Do I have one space? And starts asking and trying to dig further in, then I can start to see curiosity. I'm like, okay, you're asking me a lot of questions, and I'm seeing more than curiosity. That's the thing with the soft skills. Usually one example, one piece of evidence, covers multiple soft skills. So that shows curiosity, it shows an ability to understand the problem and then communicate. Understand the problem, break down the knowns and the unknowns, and then communicate that back to me. Like, here's what I understand, here's what I don't, and then here's what I need help with. That's a lot of different soft skills from just one set, like one question essentially, or two sets of questions. And those examples have to be specific. So, for example, a bad curiosity question would be, oh, sorry, let me rephrase that. If I am trying to provide evidence, if I'm trying to prove that a candidate will work well at the company, will succeed at the job, and I'm trying to give evidence to, let's say, my boss, or a hiring manager, or the CTO, bad evidence is they asked a lot of questions. That doesn't tell me much about the candidate. People can ask questions in a lot of different ways. They could ask questions that were just trying to essentially get the answer out of me without necessarily understanding. And it's not immediately obvious whether or not just a question is going to exhibit that curiosity. A better example is the candidate became stuck because they didn't understand how a string was formatted. They then asked me to walk them through the string formatting a second time. Cool, okay, they want to know more about this. They're telling me they don't know and they're trying to dive in. They then asked me whether multiple spaces matter, since a user could be bitten by an overly strict formatter. Now I have curiosity, and there's another soft skill. They're thinking about the user. They're saying, hey, someone else is going to fall for this. They're showing a certain social awareness for, I'm going to write this code, and someone else is going to be responsible in the future. I hope it doesn't break for them. So this one piece of evidence now shows a lot of different soft skills that I'm hopefully looking for. So once you have your evidence, once you've interviewed a candidate multiple times and tried to have all of your different interviewers test for these requirements in a lot of different ways, you then have to come together and you have to decide whether or not they met the bar. But what is that? The bar is your risk tolerance. Your risk tolerance acknowledges that you're going to make mistakes. When you are hiring, you are going to screw up. There's basically two ways to screw up. You can hire someone who can't do the job, or you can reject someone that can do the job. That second one, rejecting someone that is able to do the job, is super common. Like that happens all the time. I've interviewed tons of people where I'm like, they probably could, but I wasn't able to collect evidence. And this is frustrating, and maybe I need to refine my interview process to see if I can do better, to make sure I'm collecting the information that lets me prove that they would be able to succeed. But the problem is that hiring someone who can't do the job is a lot more expensive than not hiring someone who can. So a false positive, you hire someone who can't do the job, or a false negative. False positives are way more expensive because someone comes on board, they work for a couple of months, and then they potentially cause some form of damage, whether it's morale, whether it's taking people a lot more time than you expected, and you may have to let them go. And then that also damages morale. And that also is damaging for the person too, because they thought they had the secure job, and 3 months later, all of a sudden it's gone. It's really bad for everybody. So it's a lot more expensive and scary to have a false positive. And there's your risk tolerance. How willing are you to have a false positive and deal with the consequences? And for most companies, the answer is pretty low. You can play with that margin a little bit, but they would rather some companies would rather reject 100 viable candidates and hire one negative one. And that's unfortunate. Now, what happens is you can modify your risk tolerance a little bit, again, by knowing your requirements. Really, really, really knowing what you're hiring for, because now you're asking the right questions. You're asking questions that actually determine whether or not someone can do the job. If you're not asking those questions, if you're asking random things, you're going to be rejecting a lot of people because you didn't actually give them the opportunity to show you them at their best. And that's what you should be doing. You should be creating an environment where they can succeed as much as possible. So, how is this valuable for you? So I've been talking a lot about this from the interviewer side, but my assumption, I guess, coming in is that there's going to be more people interviewing than interviewers. I obviously was recently interviewing, seeing as I have been officially working for 28 and a half hours now. So we're going to sit on both sides of the table. So how is this valuable if you're interviewing? Well, by understanding the pipelines, by understanding that when someone is interviewing you, You're dealing with an individual, you're dealing with a company, and you're dealing with a system. All three of these things that you're having to maneuver at the same time. The company as a whole is fairly obvious. The system is the hiring pipeline. And the individual or individuals are the real people that you're talking to. Each one of them with their own set of knowledge and biases and whatever may have happened. They could have had a bad day. You could get unlucky and have someone who's just really didn't sleep well last night and is grumpy, and that tilts them one way or another. So what can you do to mitigate this? So first is understanding the real job requirements. Like a lot of jobs don't post the real requirements. They post an idea, they post sort of what they're looking for, but they usually post way too advanced. And so by reaching out to recruiters, or if you can talk to someone directly, you can start asking them, hey, is this a hard requirement? Do I need to know TypeScript, or do I need to know Java? Or do you just want me to be able to learn this on the job and show I can code? Do I need to really have these many years of experience? And you can even ask more poking questions like, have you hired people before who don't fit these requirements? That's like one of the key ones. If the answer is yes, you go, cool. Why aren't you willing to do that now? And not necessarily in an aggressive way, but just truly trying to understand where they're coming from. And ironically, by doing that, you can actually start to exhibit a lot of the qualities that they're looking for. Because now you're being inquisitive and curious. You're starting to understand the system and their whole system. You're trying to understand what their motivation in their business is before you even enter a technical interview. And now you've got people that are a bit more on your side. They're now biased towards you because you're trying to work with them to understand what their pain points are. Second one is understanding your job requirements. I mean, all of us have different situations in life, and not all roles will work for all of us. Some jobs, unfortunately, require insane 60-hour weeks. That doesn't work for a lot of people, very understandably. That causes a lot of burnout. If you're not willing to do that, then know that about yourself and be willing to just pass on jobs that aren't going to work for you. Similarly, I call it mission versus paycheck. Some companies will pay really, really well, but the job may not be that interesting or exciting. How much does that matter to you? And do you care if you feel inspired to come to work, or is it just like, hey, I really need a paycheck? And there's not a right answer on this. Like, I know it can be easy to think, oh, well, clearly I should say mission, but no. Like, a lot of kind of boring work really does need to get done. And a lot of people have priorities that are more than just their job. Like, maybe the number one thing you do is either play in a band or certain sports, and your job is just the part of your life that supports everything else. That's great. You're going to have an awesome life. The paycheck is now more important to you. And so if someone's selling on a mission saying, hey, we've got a really cool opportunity here, you say, great, but the bank's going to pay me more. Or great, but this other company is going to pay me more. And I'm like, that's just what matters to me. How much do you value stability over growth? This is actually a pretty big one in determining like who and how you're going to be reaching out. Because startups are obviously less stable, more growth potential. Larger companies are more stable, potentially less growth potential, potentially larger paychecks. It's a risk tolerance thing, but it's your own personal. And understanding what your values are and communicating those clearly helps you find what you want, and again, reinforces to the interviewers, reinforces to the hiring managers that you're that much better of a candidate. Because you'll be, again, communicating clearly about the system that they have, their business, and how you can react and interact with it, how you would like to. You have a plan. That shows a lot of positive skills. Be engaged. The more you're talking and the more you're actually reaching out to your recruiters or to the interviewees or the hiring managers, the more questions you're asking too, the more you're interacting with folks, the better off you generally are. In my experience, people under-communicate, over-communicate 100%. 99.999% of the time. You can, and this is riskier, practice offering feedback. For example, the email that I sent. I told them their interview was bad, but I didn't really have anything to lose. Like it said, hey, based on their metrics, I have failed so catastrophic, so badly. And they could point to that and say, yeah, sorry, and that's fair. But I decided to try and give them some constructive feedback saying, hey, I don't think you're measuring the thing that matters to you. I don't think this is what you're actually going for, and here's how you could look at it. in a way that would be beneficial to both of us. And it worked. It doesn't always. And depending on when you give that feedback, you can be risking things. You give a little bit too much critical feedback, not everyone is open to it, and you can potentially shut down opportunities. So it's worth thinking about, but is riskier. Understand your interviewers. They're all humans. I've been in a lot of interviews. Interestingly enough, I've interviewed people who knew way more about the question than I did. Like a lot more about the question than I did. And they still weren't able to pass the interview because they understood the mathematics behind the question. They understood all of these details behind the question, but they couldn't code it. And they couldn't communicate to me the things that they were struggling with. And it was really unfortunate because I'm like, well, you know more about the math here, but I'm hiring for a coding role, and there's no evidence here that you're actually able to code the things that you understand. I'm sorry. And then what evidence are they looking for? Like as you're interviewing, you can read your interviewer and start trying to think what matters to them. They'll give different signals. For instance, how open they are to communicating with you. For example, if someone's very into asking questions and talking back and forth, then they're probably trying to assess how much you communicate and how well you express your ideas. That's probably what they're trying to actually assess, not necessarily what they're saying that they're assessing. Show more of that. You can just talk more, you can work with them more, you can start asking them more questions, and you can start giving them more evidence to basically prove to their hiring manager that you're a good fit. Be open and honest. I can't stress this one enough, and it's hard because we all get, it sounds weird to say it's hard, but we all get nervous, especially when interviewing, and we all want to look really good. So if we don't know something, or if we're asked a question we don't understand, it can be really tempting to try to fudge it a bit. It's honestly better to say, I have no idea what you're talking about, but I'm going to try and figure it out. Here's what I understand, and here's what I don't. And just in that alone, I've already seen, like, okay, you can communicate. This is fantastic. And then I can work with somebody to start trying to build and pull the details out. It's not a guarantee, but being open, being honest, and as much as possible being calm and comfortable, which is always hard, always works in your favor. I said it before, lean towards over communicating. Engineering and software development are really complicated. They require a lot of communication. There's going to be whiteboarding. There's going to be talking with product managers, maybe talking with customers, trying to figure out what the specs are. Specs are going to be vague. You're not going to have any idea what you're supposed to be doing. And so you have to go back and ask the customer, hey, I don't understand this. Like, I don't know is one of the things that I say probably most often in my job. It's one of my favorite phrases. And so over communicating, talking and saying, okay, what are you actually looking for, or is this what you are looking for? Having that conversation back and forth is really valuable in the interview process because that's what a lot of your job's going to be. And so it goes to the last thing. See your interviewer as a tool to solve the problem because they'll hopefully be one of your coworkers soon. So the sooner you start communicating with them and the sooner you start interacting with them like you would just in a normal work environment, then the sooner, hopefully, you'll actually be working with them. And the better chance you'll have of exhibiting your best qualities. Thank you very much. Any questions?
So I'm one of the job placement directors here.
Yeah.
So my question is, there are some, you operate sometimes off the 25 most asked questions sort of thing. Well, some of the questions seem rather backhanded, like they're designed to trick you.
Yeah.
So in a situation like that, what would you recommend people who are interviewing do?
That's a good question. It's going to be a little bit context specific, but in general, if I got thrown a question that I thought was designed to trick me, I would honestly use a pretty similar strategy as I do with all questions I don't understand. I would start by saying, I don't quite understand this. Can I get more details? And start asking about this. Try to understand what I don't understand. Try to get my known unknowns. And then go forward saying, okay, I don't get this piece. Can you please elaborate? I don't get this piece. Can you please elaborate? If the whole point of that is to trick somebody and they're trying to they're trying to get you to stumble, they're trying to get you to not understand something, then there's a certain question I'd ask myself of, do I want to work here, honestly? Oftentimes I'll see those questions come up because that's just what everyone else does. And that's what people are used to asking, and they're not necessarily sure what a better way is. And in that circumstance, it's a lot easier to maneuver because by going in and saying, well, I don't get this or this or this, here are the things that don't make sense to me, please elaborate. I'd hopefully be a little more specific about please elaborate. So I'd have to have a specific example to dive into. But that would be my strategy, is just highlighting what I don't know and then trying to get them to help you through it. Yeah.
Generally speaking, do you think in soft skills a longer interview may be necessary? I mean, from what I've heard is, a shorter interview is better than a longer one. Shorter, more effective one than a longer one where maybe you could get the interviewer lost or bored.
Mm-hmm. You mean as a...
So in general, what do you think? Should you care about the length? You know what I mean?
You mean as an interviewee, should I care about the length of the interview? I would say no. It depends a little bit. It's not the length of the interview itself. It's usually the length of the day. And even that isn't necessarily intentional. There's some companies that'll do full day-long interviews and start to let people go halfway through the day if they clearly aren't making the bar. And then, okay, it's a full day interview, you only get half the day, it's not gonna work out. Lots of companies have a fixed set, fixed time allotted for which interviewers are gonna go and interview a candidate. Oftentimes it's 45 minutes. For certain candidates or certain types of interviews, it's a little bit longer, hours than an hour. And that time is pretty much fixed. So it's somewhat up to the interviewer to guide the interview through that length. And they're going to try to fix it into that time allotted, more regardless of what happens left, or regardless of what happens within it, because they have other things to do in their day and they have other things on the schedule. So I wouldn't worry too much about the length of any individual interview, maybe a little bit about the length of the day, but I will admit, as an interviewer, one of my biggest fears, it's never happened, but is that someone will get my question in 5 minutes. Like, if someone comes in and just writes the answer on the board, I'm like, crap, okay, now what? Because maybe you've seen the question before. I don't have any evidence showing me that you went through the problem-solving process, and I gotta find another question to ask you. So that's honestly kind of challenging. Having a candidate have to work through the problem and see how they think about it is generally the idea. And so there being a little bit of length to it is not an issue in my opinion.
And to be a little bit more specific, let's say interviewer asks you a question and the thinking process whether you should admit that you don't know it or solve the question, or just think about it, trying to solve it. That takes a little bit longer than admit that you don't know something. So which one of the two is it better?
I actually don't see them as mutually exclusive, unless I'm misunderstanding.
Because it's like sometimes you don't know the answer, but you could try to figure out in your head, and then that takes longer. So then that makes you more nervous, rather than that. You know what I mean? You could probably just admit that you don't know something. That we could just move forward, or I don't know which of the two.
Okay, I think I understand better. So, I guess it depends on the thing you don't know. So if you're in the middle of an interview, and, well, the expectation is that you won't know everything, actually. The expectation of the interview is you won't know everything off the bat, and the reason for that is because, again, an interviewer is trying to collect evidence of your problem-solving skills or of your soft skills. And if you know everything ahead of time, then you can just write an essay and that would be it. Maybe that's a decent way to go, honestly. But if you're doing a live interview, you want to see the process, which means I want someone to not know everything, but I want them to work through it. If someone doesn't know something, oftentimes, the best way it goes, the best candidates I've seen, the ones that I've been like the strongest hire on, usually start off going, huh. And sometimes they'll honestly say, I'm not sure. let me think about this, and they explain their thought process, they explain the back and forth, and then as an interviewer, that helps me understand where they're struggling, because with most questions, candidates will usually end up in a couple of different funnels of where they get stuck. They'll get stuck on maybe 3 or 4 different ideas, and as they explain this to me, I can see where they're getting stuck. I have my standard hints and my standard questions that I ask to try to help guide them through those sticking points. And then I can do that more easily. I had a candidate, one of the strangest interviews I did. The candidate had, he solved the problem, but I don't know how. He went through the whole process and he was writing things on the board, and I'm trying to follow his thoughts. I was like, okay, well, I don't know what that code has to do with the problem. I don't know what that has to do with the other thing that you wrote on there. There's 3 different things, and then he wrote the answer on the board, but I couldn't follow it. And I wasn't entirely sure. I had a friend with me who was one of the hiring managers and curious to see like my style of interviewing, so she just shadowed me, and I walked out and I looked at her and I'm like, did I miss something there? And she went, no, I'm not quite sure how I figured that out either. And unfortunately, because of that, we actually ended up passing, because the answer was technically correct, but the thought process was really scattered. And so when I'm working with someone, if I'm working with a person and they just disappear for a week and then come back with all of this code, I mean, that's not great. Like, I need to know what's going on, because they're going to move on to other things that all needs to be communicated. So I would definitely communicate over. Yeah. Yeah.
I guess kind of going off that, are you more hesitant to consider someone who is just like answering every question versus someone who is going through the process?
Not necessarily. The most important thing is seeing the thought process. If someone answers a question really quickly, that is definitely not against them. If I can see where they started, if they write on the board, here's where I am, here's what I understand, or if they're typing and we're doing like because most industries trying to move away from whiteboarding, but I have done a lot of whiteboarding interviews, for better or for worse. But if they're either writing on the board or they're typing out, they're writing the code, if I see their start point, and then I see the steps they took to get to the end, that gives me basically everything that I need to know. Because I know what knowledge you came in with, I know what you thought about, how many steps you're going to take to get to your final solution, and then you came up with like a final, came up with your solution right at the end, and I can see the process, I can see all the paths that went there.
Okay.
That's probably the main thing.
Is it common for you to ask someone to show their process, how they got the answer?
Not with the style of questions that for example, I'm going to show you one of the questions that I used. This was my phone screen question for a while. I would give candidates a map, just a map interface, and I would ask them to describe to me how they may implement this interface. And there was candidates who would come in, and a lot of the candidates who did really, really well had no idea where to start. And that's what they started with. I'm not sure, I guess, I'm like, okay, well, let's talk through it. How would you, what different things did you use? What data structures did you use? And we walk through the process, asking, okay, what did you do for this? And then bring up a problem that they ran into. And then I'd ask them another question, like, okay, well, have you thought about, you need to turn this object into a number. How would you do that? Have you heard of object hashing before? Because that was one of the, if you're going to do a hash map, that's what you need to do. And I had one candidate, I remember, she called in and didn't know what a hash map was, and then built a hash map in front of me. And I'm like, on site right now. So yeah, like this is a common question I would use, and I liked it because people mostly used maps. If you don't know that you've used a map, I can say, what language do you code in? Python. Cool. Do you know what a dictionary is? Yeah. Okay. Awesome. That's a map. Java. Okay. Well, there's the map class. JavaScript. You use objects, right? Yep. That's a map. So it's really easy to get to a baseline understanding, and then we can have a conversation.
Cool.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't know if that quite answered your question.
Oh, it's totally it.
Okay.
You mentioned something about giving feedback. So One of the questions that I'm normally trying to tell my students to stay away from or ask if they can answer at a later time is what do you think we can do better or differently? And I know there are companies who do ask that. And I see that as kind of a loaded question because if a company is hiring someone into the either because they have a problem that needs to be fixed, they're need someone else for the position or they're expanding, right? Or all of the above. So in that case, if a company is doing well, they don't want to have someone who's going to change a bunch of stuff. So how would you recommend people answer that question?
It's a fair question. I would actually lean towards the side of answering it if you have an answer. It's fair to say, I'm not 100, like, I don't have enough information, but I would love to learn more. However, if you feel pretty comfortable, comfortable enough with your product, then, and you have opinions about it, even if I don't necessarily agree with your opinions, if you're able to say what the pain point is, because that's usually what can we do better? Well, there's some pains in there. You describe the pain point. You then describe, okay, this is why I think this is important, and then here's a solution that I've come up with that could be valuable, which is different than saying like, oh, this sucks, I do it this other way. Like if someone comes out swinging, then that is a little bit of a red flag. If someone explains the pain that they've seen and then explains what they would do to fix it, that's actually a huge positive in my book because it shows an analytical ability beyond just coding. It also shows a lot of thoughtfulness about product and a reasonable understanding of our product, even if I would disagree with the underlying premise. Maybe I disagree with it because they don't have all the information and I have an extra detail. And if I see that, I'm like, cool, what if we give this person this other information? Maybe they come up with a solution that's better than me. That would be great. So I would say if you have an opinion and you have justification and a reason, a thought process behind it, I think that's valuable.
And then are you thinking that like in a tech interview or a soft skill interview?
I've only seen that question asked in a soft skills interview. Yeah, I've only been asked that question once personally, and I answered it. I didn't get the job. I don't think that was the reason, but I know as an interviewer, actually I think I do know the reason. One of those interviews I didn't do great, but I've only seen it on soft skills, but if it was asked on hard skills, I would probably answer it if I had an opinion there as well. But it's also, be honest. If there's not something that comes up where you're like, yes, then say that. Any other questions? Cool. Well, thank you all very much.